The heavy oak doors of St. Michael's Catholic Church slammed shut with a finality that made every head in the sanctuary turn. Father Vincent O'Malley stood with his back pressed against them, keys dangling from his weathered hand, his face set in an expression that somehow managed to combine gentle compassion with absolute immovability. Michael Brennan had made it exactly 3 steps down the center aisle before the priest moved. Outside, the February wind howled through the streets of Brooklyn's Red Hook neighborhood, rattling the stained glass windows that depicted the Stations of the Cross. Inside, the smell of melting beeswax candles mixed with the faint perfume of white lilies arranged near the altar, and beneath it all, the particular mustiness of old wool coats damp from snow. The velvet runner beneath Michael's feet felt thick, treacherous, like quicksand pulling him toward a future he suddenly couldn't face. Catherine Walsh stood at the altar in a cream-colored dress she'd sewn herself, her 3-year-old daughter Emma clutching the hem with small fists. The child wore a tiny flower crown that Catherine had woven from silk blooms, her dark eyes wide with the kind of understanding that children possess when adult worlds begin to fracture around them. "I can't," Michael said, his voice cracking across the silence. "Father, I'm sorry. I can't do this. Before we go further, I want to know, where in the world are you watching from right now? Is it morning coffee time or late night can't sleep time? Drop your location and time in the comments. And if you're invested in finding out why this priest just locked everyone inside a church in 1973, hit that like button and subscribe. You're not going to believe where this goes. The assembled guests, maybe 40 people scattered across the pews, shifted uncomfortably. Catherine's mother made a sound like a wounded animal. Michael's best man, Tommy Rizzo, grabbed his shoulder, but Michael shook him off with the desperate energy of a drowning man. "Son," Father O'Malley said quietly, his Irish accent still thick despite 30 years in Brooklyn. "You'll sit down, or you'll finish what you started, but you won't be leaving through those doors." "You can't keep me here," Michael protested, but his feet had stopped moving. "Can't I?" The priest's eyebrows rose. "I'm an old man with the keys to the only exits in this building, and I've just decided that this wedding will proceed. Or we'll all sit here until you remember why you proposed to Catherine Walsh in the first place." Michael's face flushed red. "This is insane. You can't force someone to get married." "Force?" Father O'Malley walked slowly down the aisle, his vestments rustling. "No one's forcing anything, but I am asking you to remember something. Do you recall the winter of '71? Catherine's breath caught. She knew what was coming. "That was the winter the archdiocese wanted to close St. Michael's," the priest continued, addressing not just Michael, but the entire congregation. "Our boiler died. Our roof leaked. We had 17 families in this parish and collection plates that barely covered the electric bill. They gave us until Easter to raise $12,000, or they'd sell the building to developers." The sanctuary felt colder suddenly, as if the memory itself had dropped the temperature. Catherine Walsh, Father O'Malley said, turning to look at the bride, was 19 years old, unwed, pregnant, working 2 jobs and taking night classes at Brooklyn College because she refused to let her circumstances define her future. She had every reason to worry about her own survival and exactly 0 reason to care about a dying parish church. Michael's jaw clenched. He hadn't known this story, not all of it. "But she cared anyway," the priest said softly. "She organized a fundraiser, a dinner, a raffle, a bake sale that ran for 3 months straight. She called every business in Red Hook, knocked on doors in neighborhoods where a young woman alone wasn't safe. She worked until her hands bled and her feet swelled, and she never asked for a single thing in return. Emma tugged her mother's dress. Catherine bent down, whispering something that made the child nod solemnly. By Easter, we had $14,000, Father O'Malley continued. St. Michael's was saved, and when I asked Catherine why she'd done it, do you know what she said? The question hung in the incense-thick air. She said, "Because this place gave me somewhere to pray when I had nowhere else to go. Because when everyone else looked at me with judgment, you looked at me with kindness. Because sometimes we save the things that once saved us." Michael stood frozen in the aisle, his face pale. Father O'Malley walked back to the altar, standing beside Catherine. "So, no, Michael Brennan, you don't have to marry this woman, but you will look her in the eye. You will tell us all why you're walking away from someone who taught this entire community what sacrificial love actually means. And then, only then, will I unlock those doors." The silence stretched taut as a wire. And that's when Catherine spoke for the first time, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Let him go, Father." But what she said next would change everything about this February afternoon and reveal a secret that Michael Brennan had been carrying since the day he proposed. A secret that explained his panic, his guilt, and the impossible choice he thought he was facing at the altar. Catherine's words carried across the sanctuary like a prayer whispered in an empty cathedral, soft but impossible to ignore. "Let him go, Father, because I won't marry a man who stays out of obligation." She lifted Emma into her arms, the child's flower crown slipping sideways. The gesture was pure maternal instinct, shielding her daughter from the adult storm breaking around them. But there was something else in Catherine's posture, too, a dignity that made several guests sit up straighter, suddenly ashamed they'd been witnessing what they thought was her humiliation. Michael turned to look at her fully for the first time since he'd tried to bolt. In the candlelight filtering through stained glass, Catherine Walsh looked nothing like the desperate 19-year-old the priest had described. At 24, she'd carved out a life against impossible odds. She'd finished her degree. She'd raised Emma alone while working as a secretary at a law firm in downtown Brooklyn. She'd become the kind of woman who could stand at an altar in a homemade dress and somehow look like royalty. "Catherine," Michael started, his voice breaking. "No," she interrupted gently. "You don't owe me an explanation. You asked me to marry you. I said yes. But I said yes to a man who wanted to be here, not someone who had to be locked inside a church to go through with it." Father O'Malley watched this exchange with the patient attention of someone who'd spent 40 years hearing confessions. He didn't unlock the doors. He simply waited. Tommy Rizzo cleared his throat from the front pew. "Mike, man, just talk to her." But Michael couldn't seem to form words. His hands opened and closed at his sides, his breathing shallow. He looked less like a groom getting cold feet and more like a man standing on the edge of a confession that would detonate his entire world. "There's something you need to know," he finally managed. "Something I should have told you before I proposed, before any of this." Catherine set Emma down carefully, whispering for her to go sit with Grandma. The little girl obeyed, her patent leather shoes making soft clicks against the stone floor. Only when Emma was safely settled did Catherine turn back to Michael, her arms crossed protectively over her chest. "Then tell me now." The radiators along the walls hissed and clanked, working overtime against the February cold. Someone in the back pews coughed. The sound echoed in the vaulted ceiling like a judgment. "I'm sick," Michael said. The two words landed like a physical blow. Catherine's face went white. What? I've been sick for 8 months, since last June. Michael's voice steadied now that the truth was finally escaping. I went to the doctor because I kept losing weight, kept feeling tired. They ran tests, more tests, and in September they told me I have a tumor in my lung, inoperable. Father O'Malley's expression shifted from stern to stricken. Several women in the congregation gasped. Tommy Rizzo stood up, then sat back down, looking like he'd been punched. The doctors said I might have 2 years. Michael continued, his eyes locked on Catherine. Maybe less. And I proposed to you in December because I thought I could give you something. Security, my veterans' benefits, the apartment, my savings. I thought if we were married, at least you and Emma would be taken care of after I was gone. Catherine's hand went to her mouth. But standing here today, about to make promises I won't be able to keep, about to watch you become a widow before you even get to be a wife. His voice cracked completely. I couldn't do it. I couldn't trap you in that. You deserve better than a dying man's guilt offering. The sanctuary felt impossibly small suddenly, as if the walls were pressing in. Emma began to cry softly in her grandmother's arms, sensing the weight of something she couldn't name. The smell of candle wax grew stronger, mixing with the wool and perfume and the particular scent of old wood that had absorbed a century of prayers and grief. Catherine walked down the 3 steps from the altar. Her heels clicked with purpose. She crossed the distance between them until she stood directly in front of Michael Brennan, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes. You thought you were protecting me, she said quietly. I thought I was being selfish, he whispered back. Wanting to be your husband, even for just a little while. Wanting to be Emma's father, even if... She slapped him. The crack of her palm against his cheek echoed in the rafters. Several people gasped. Father O'Malley didn't move. That's for proposing to me without telling me the truth, Catherine said, her voice shaking with fury and something else, something that sounded almost like hope. For thinking you get to decide what I deserve, for assuming I'm too weak to handle reality. Michael's hand went to his reddening cheek, stunned. And this, Catherine said, rising on her toes and kissing him hard on the mouth, is for proposing to me at all, for wanting to marry me anyway, for being stupid enough to think I'd rather have comfort than love. When she pulled back, tears were streaming down both their faces. I don't want your veterans' benefits, Michael Brennan, she said fiercely. I don't want your apartment or your savings or whatever financial security you think you're offering. I want 2 years with you, or 1 year, or 6 months. I want however much time God gives us, and I want to spend every single day of it as your wife. But Father O'Malley knew something else was coming, could see it in the way Catherine's mother had gone very still in the back pew, in the way Catherine herself seemed to be gathering courage for her own confession. Because it turned out Michael Brennan wasn't the only one carrying a secret to the altar that day. And what Catherine revealed next would explain why this wedding wasn't just about love or obligation, or even terminal illness, but about a promise made years ago in this very church. A promise that bound her to St. Michael's in ways that had nothing to do with fundraising or gratitude, and everything to do with the darkest night of her life. Catherine's fingers trembled as she reached up to touch the small gold cross at her throat, a nervous habit Michael had noticed before, but never questioned. Before you decide whether to stay or go, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, I need to tell you about the night Emma was born. Father O'Malley's eyes closed briefly, as if he'd been dreading this moment, but knew it was necessary. He moved to sit in the front pew, suddenly looking every one of his 68 years. It was October of 1969. Catherine began, addressing the entire church now, not just Michael. The tail end of Hurricane Camille's remnants hit New York. The subways flooded. Trees came down all over Brooklyn, and I went into labor 3 weeks early, alone in my apartment on Van Brunt Street. The radiators hissed again. Outside, the February wind matched the memory of that October storm, howling against the church walls. Emma's father, Catherine paused, choosing her words carefully, had left 2 months before. When I told him I was pregnant, he gave me $200 and an address for a clinic in Manhattan. Said if I didn't take care of it, he'd deny the baby was his. Said his family would destroy me if I tried to claim anything from him. Emma's grandmother made a small sound of pain, hearing details her daughter had never shared before. So I was alone, Catherine continued. 19 years old, in labor, with floodwater rising in the streets outside. The phone lines were down. I couldn't get to the hospital. I was terrified, not just of dying, but of what would happen to my baby if something went wrong. If we both died, and no one even knew. Michael reached for her hand. This time she let him take it. I prayed, Catherine said simply. For the first time in months I prayed, and I promised God that if we survived the night, I would spend my life doing something that mattered, something that helped people. I didn't know what that meant exactly, but I made the promise anyway. The candles flickered as if in response to her words. Around midnight, someone knocked on my door. Father O'Malley. He'd been checking on parishioners during the storm, going door to door despite the flooding. He found me halfway through labor, bleeding, barely conscious. Father O'Malley spoke then, his voice rough with memory. I've never been so frightened in my life. I'm a priest, not a doctor. I knew nothing about delivering babies, but the streets were impassable. Ambulances couldn't get through, so I did what I could. He boiled water on my little stove, Catherine said, tore up clean sheets, talked me through every contraction like he'd done it 100 times before. And when Emma finally came, her voice broke. When she came out silent, not breathing, turning blue. Several women in the congregation were crying now. Father O'Malley breathed life into her, Catherine finished. Literally, gave her mouth-to-mouth resuscitation until she gasped and screamed and turned pink. He saved both our lives that night. The weight of this revelation settled over the sanctuary like snow. That's why I fundraised for St. Michael's, Catherine said, looking at Michael now. Not out of general gratitude, but because I owed a debt I could never fully repay. This man, she gestured to the priest, gave me my daughter, gave me my life, and the only thing I could think to do was make sure his church survived. Michael's grip on her hand tightened. Catherine. But there's more, she interrupted. The promise I made that night about doing something that mattered? I thought fundraising was it. I thought working 2 jobs and getting my degree and raising Emma to be kind and brave. I thought that was enough. She turned to face the altar, the crucified Christ hanging above it. But last year, when you proposed, Michael, I went back to Father O'Malley. I told him I was going to marry you, and I asked if he thought God would release me from my promise. Because marrying you felt selfish. It felt like I was choosing my own happiness over whatever larger purpose I was supposed to serve. What did he tell you? Michael asked quietly. Father O'Malley answered. I told her that love is never selfish, that raising a child with kindness is purpose enough for any life, and that the God I serve doesn't demand perpetual suffering as payment for survival. But he also told me something else, Catherine said. He told me about a family in the parish, a young mother with 2 children whose husband had died in Vietnam. She was about to lose her apartment, had nowhere to go. And Father O'Malley asked if maybe my promise could be fulfilled by helping her, by sharing what little I had. The pieces were coming together now, clicking into place. So I gave her my apartment, Catherine said, the one I'd lived in since Emma was born. I gave her my furniture, my savings, everything except what fit in 2 suitcases. Emma and I moved in with my mother. She looked at Michael with fierce honesty. That's why I said yes when you proposed. Not because I needed rescuing, but because I finally felt free. I'd kept my promise. I'd helped someone the way Father O'Malley helped me. I was ready to start my own life. Michael pulled her close, his face buried in her hair. You should have told me. You should have told me about being sick, she countered, but there was no anger in it now, only sad understanding. They stood there in the center aisle, holding each other while 40 witnesses watched, and February wind rattled the windows, and Emma's soft crying finally quieted in her grandmother's arms. Father O'Malley stood slowly, his knees cracking. So now you both know the truth. Michael Brennan, you're dying. Catherine Walsh, you've already given everything away. You're both standing here with nothing to offer except yourselves. He walked to the altar, picking up the small, leather book that contained the marriage ceremony. Which means, the priest continued, you're finally ready to actually get married, because marriage isn't about what you can give each other. It's about who you choose to be when everything else is stripped away. But before anyone could respond, the church doors, still locked, shuddered under the impact of someone pounding from outside. 3 heavy blows that echoed like gunshots. Then a man's voice, muffled but urgent. Open up! Police! We need to speak to Catherine Walsh immediately! And in that moment, everyone in St. Michael's Church realized that this wedding was about to become something else entirely. Because the past Catherine thought she'd escaped was standing on the other side of those locked oak doors, and it had finally caught up to her. The pounding came again, harder this time, rattling the ancient hinges. Father O'Malley's hand tightened on his keyring, but he made no move toward the doors. Catherine Walsh, the voice called again. This is Detective Raymond Shaw, NYPD. I need to speak with you regarding an urgent matter. Catherine's face drained of color. Michael felt her sway slightly against him, and he wrapped his arm around her waist to steady her. Do you know who that is? He whispered. She nodded, unable to speak. Emma's grandmother stood up abruptly from the back pew, her face twisted with an emotion somewhere between rage and terror. Don't open those doors, Father, she said, her voice carrying across the sanctuary with surprising force. Don't you dare open them. Mrs. Walsh, Father O'Malley said gently, if the police... He's not here as police, the older woman interrupted. He's here as family, and that family gave up their rights to my daughter 4 years ago when they threw money at her and told her to disappear. The revelation hit Michael like cold water. He turned to Catherine, understanding dawning in his eyes. Emma's father. He's connected to this detective? Catherine found her voice, though it came out thin and strained. Raymond Shaw is Emma's uncle. His younger brother James Shaw, he's Emma's father. The pieces fell into a pattern that made Michael's stomach turn. The Shaws were one of Brooklyn's most prominent families, Old money, political connections, a legacy that stretched back to before the Civil War. James Shaw had been a rising star in his father's real estate empire when Catherine had met him, when he'd seduced a teenage college student and then discarded her like garbage when the consequences became inconvenient. "Miss Walsh, I know you can hear me," Detective Shaw called through the door, his tone shifting to something more conciliatory. "I'm not here to cause trouble, but there's a situation involving my father. He's in the hospital. He's asking for you. It's urgent." Catherine's mother let out a bitter laugh. "Harold Shaw wouldn't cross the street to spit on my daughter if she were on fire. Why would he ask for her now?" "Because he's dying," came the muffled response. "And before he goes, he wants to make things right." The sanctuary filled with murmured conversation. Several guests were putting pieces together now, realizing that the young mother they'd known as Catherine Walsh, hard-working, humble, devoted to her daughter, had been involved with one of New York's most powerful families. That little Emma, playing with her flower crown in the back pew, was a Shaw by blood, if not by name. Father O'Malley looked at Catherine with gentle concern. "What do you want to do, child?" Catherine stood very still, her hand still clasped in Michael's. Through the stained glass, the weak February sun painted colored shadows across her cream-colored dress, red and blue and gold, like she was already bruised by the decision she had to make. "How did he know I was here?" she asked, not moving toward the door. There was a pause from outside. Then, "Your mother made arrangements at this church. Flowers, music. We have people who keep track of these things. Catherine, my father has something to tell you. Something about Emma. About her future. Please." "Her future is with me," Catherine said, loud enough for the detective to hear. "Whatever Harold Shaw wants, he can write it in a letter and mail it to my lawyer." "You don't have a lawyer," Detective Shaw replied, and there was something almost sad in his voice. "And what my father wants to tell you can't be written down. It's too complicated, too important." Michael leaned close to Catherine's ear. "Do you want to go? I'll come with you. We can postpone." "No," Catherine said firmly. She turned to face the congregation, her chin lifted. "I spent 4 years letting the Shaw family dictate my life, letting their money and their shame dictate who I could be, where I could go, whether I deserved dignity or just survival. I'm not giving them another day." She called out to the detective. "Tell your father that if he wants to make things right, he can start by acknowledging his granddaughter, publicly, in writing, with his lawyers present. Until then, I have a wedding to finish." The silence from outside stretched long enough that people began to wonder if the detective had left. Then his voice came again, quieter now, almost pleading. "Catherine, my father has terminal cancer, pancreatic. The doctors say he has maybe a week, and he claims—" The detective paused, as if struggling with what he was about to say. "He claims that James isn't Emma's real father." The sanctuary erupted in gasps and exclamations. Catherine went rigid. "What did you say?" "He says there was a mistake at the hospital, a mix-up with paternity tests. He says James couldn't have fathered Emma because James is sterile, has been since he had mumps as a teenager. My father covered it up back then, paid people to falsify the results, because he thought you were trying to trap James into marriage." Michael felt Catherine's hand go slack in his. He tightened his grip, keeping her upright. "But now he's dying," Detective Shaw continued, "and his conscience is killing him faster than the cancer. He says he has documents, proof. He says Emma's real father is someone else entirely, and that man deserves to know his daughter exists. Father O'Malley moved to Catherine's side, steadying her other arm. "This could be a lie," he said quietly. "A manipulation to get you outside, to get Emma. Or it could be the truth," Catherine whispered. She looked at Emma, still sitting with her grandmother, the child's dark eyes watching everything with that preternatural awareness that some children possess. "Oh God, what if it's the truth?" The smell of candle wax suddenly seemed overwhelming, mixing with the mustiness of old stone and the lingering perfume of lilies. The radiators clanked again, working against the cold seeping through the walls. Outside, a car horn honked somewhere distant, a reminder that the normal world was still turning while this small sanctuary existed in suspended time. "Let me see these documents," Father O'Malley called to the detective. "Slide them under the door. They're at the hospital, with my father, with his lawyer. This isn't something we can do through a crack in a door, Father. This is Catherine's life, Emma's life. Don't you think they deserve answers?" Catherine pulled away from both Michael and the priest. She walked slowly toward the doors, her footsteps echoing on stone. When she reached them, she pressed her palm flat against the old oak, as if she could feel the truth through the wood. "If I come with you," she said, "Michael comes too, and Father O'Malley, and my mother and Emma. All of us, or none of us." "Agreed," Detective Shaw said immediately. "My car is right outside." Catherine turned to look at Michael. In her eyes he saw fear and hope, and the terrible weight of a question she'd thought was answered 4 years ago. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know this is supposed to be our day, but—" "Hey," Michael said gently, crossing to her and cupping her face in his hands. "I just told you I'm dying. You think I'm worried about postponing a wedding? We go together. We find out the truth together. And then we come back here and we get married. All of us." He looked at Father O'Malley. "The church will still be here in a few hours, right?" The priest smiled sadly. "The church has been here for 90 years. It'll wait a little longer." As Father O'Malley finally unlocked the doors, as winter light and cold air rushed in, as Detective Raymond Shaw stood on the steps in his dark overcoat, looking nothing like a villain and everything like a man bearing an impossible burden, Catherine Walsh realized that her wedding day was about to become something else entirely. A reckoning, a revelation, and possibly the answer to a question she'd never dared to ask. What if Emma's real father wasn't a monster who'd abandoned them, but someone else? Someone who'd never known she existed. Someone who might have loved them if given the chance? But the truth waiting at Brooklyn Methodist Hospital was stranger and more devastating than any of them could have imagined, because Harold Shaw's deathbed confession wouldn't just reveal Emma's real father. It would expose a conspiracy that had destroyed multiple lives, and prove that sometimes the greatest cruelty isn't abandonment, but the deliberate theft of a family that should have been. Brooklyn Methodist Hospital smelled of disinfectant and overcooked vegetables, the fluorescent lights humming overhead like electronic prayers. Catherine walked through the corridors with Emma's hand gripped tightly in hers, Michael on her other side, Father O'Malley and her mother trailing behind. Detective Shaw led them past nurses' stations and waiting rooms filled with families keeping vigil in plastic chairs. Harold Shaw's private room was on the 7th floor, corner suite with a view of the East River, the kind of accommodation that money bought even in death. 2 men in expensive suits stood outside the door, lawyers, clearly, their briefcases held like shields against whatever truth was about to emerge. "Before you go in," Detective Shaw said, stopping Catherine just outside the room, "I need you to understand something. My father is not a good man. He's done terrible things in his life. But I believe what he's about to tell you is the truth. And I believe—" his voice dropped. "I believe he genuinely wants to make amends before he dies." Catherine's mother snorted. Amends. As if a deathbed confession erases 4 years of my daughter being treated like trash. "No, Mrs. Walsh, it doesn't," the detective agreed quietly. "Nothing erases that. But maybe it explains it." He opened the door. Harold Shaw looked nothing like the imposing figure Catherine remembered from 4 years ago. The man who'd sat across from her in his Manhattan office and told her in precise, emotionless language exactly how much her silence was worth. $200 and a promise to never contact his son again. Had withered to a skeleton draped in hospital gown and blankets. His skin had the yellowish tint of organ failure, and his breathing came in shallow, labored gasps through oxygen tubes. But his eyes were still sharp, still calculating, still the eyes of a man accustomed to controlling every situation. "Miss Walsh," he rasped, attempting to sit up straighter. One of the lawyers moved to adjust his pillows. "Thank you for coming. And the child? That's Emma?" Catherine pulled Emma closer, a protective gesture that made Harold Shaw's mouth twist in something that might have been regret or simply pain. "Before we begin," one of the lawyers interjected, "I need to establish for the record that Mr. Shaw is of sound mind and acting of his own free will in making this disclosure. Father O'Malley, as a witness of good standing, would you agree to—" "I'll witness whatever needs witnessing," the priest interrupted, his tone brooking no nonsense. "But let's dispense with legal theater. This man is dying and these people deserve the truth. Harold, say what you need to say." Harold Shaw looked at the priest with something approaching gratitude. Then he turned his attention back to Catherine. "4 years ago," he began, each word clearly costing him effort, "my son James came to me and told me he'd gotten a college girl, pregnant. He was panicked, desperate. His mother and I had plans for him, a proper marriage to a girl from a good family, a position in the company, a political future eventually. This pregnancy threatened all of that." Catherine's hand tightened on Emma's. Michael moved closer, his presence a silent promise of support. "James insisted he'd been careful," Harold continued. "Said it couldn't possibly be his child. So I arranged for a paternity test. Pulled strings to have it done quickly, quietly. And when the results came back saying James was the father—" He paused, struggling for breath. "I didn't believe them." "Why not?" Father O'Malley asked. "Because James had mumps when he was 14. Severe case. His doctor told us then that he would likely never be able to father children. We kept it quiet. Didn't even tell James the full extent of the damage. Let him believe he was fine. But I knew. I knew that paternity test had to be wrong." The room felt airless suddenly despite the oxygen machine's steady hiss. "So I had the test redone," Harold said, "by a different lab, under the table, and the second test confirmed what I already suspected. James Shaw was not Emma's biological father." Catherine's mother made a strangled sound. Michael's arm went around Catherine's shoulders as her knees threatened to give out. "But you still paid me to go away," Catherine said, her voice hollow. "You still treated me like I was trying to trap your son." "Because I thought you were lying about James being the only one," Harold admitted, and there was genuine shame in his voice now. "I thought you'd been with multiple men and were pinning it on James because he had money. So yes, I paid you off. I made you sign papers promising never to contact our family. I told James the paternity test was negative so he could wash his hands of the whole mess with a clear conscience. You destroyed my life based on an assumption, Catherine whispered. I destroyed multiple lives, Harold corrected. Because about 6 months ago, when the cancer diagnosis came and I knew I was dying, I started going through old files, tying up loose ends, making sure my affairs were in order, and I found something I'd forgotten about. He gestured weakly to one of the lawyers, who opened a briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. The second paternity test, Harold said. The real one. I'd filed it away and never looked at it again. But when I read it this time, when I actually read the detailed results instead of just the conclusion, I found something I'd missed 4 years ago. The lawyer handed the folder to Father O'Malley, who opened it carefully. His face went pale as he scanned the document. What does it say? Catherine asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Father O'Malley looked up, his eyes moving from Catherine to Michael and back again. It says that while James Shaw is not Emma's father, the test did identify genetic markers that are consistent with the Shaw family line. Specifically, he paused, checking the document again. Markers that are consistent with a first-degree relative of James Shaw. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Oh my God, Catherine's mother breathed. Raymond, you. Detective Raymond Shaw's face had gone white. He stood frozen in the doorway, his hand gripping the frame for support. No, that's impossible. Catherine and I never. Not Raymond, Harold Shaw interrupted, his voice barely audible now. My other son, Thomas. The name landed like a bomb in the small hospital room. Catherine swayed, and Michael had to physically hold her upright. Thomas Shaw? She repeated, her voice rising. Your son who died? Your son who was killed in Vietnam? Thomas wasn't killed in Vietnam, Harold said, and now tears were sliding down his withered cheeks. That's what we told everyone. That's what we told his friends, his fiancé, even Raymond. But Thomas didn't die overseas. He deserted. Came home in secret in the summer of '69, stayed with a friend in Brooklyn, was trying to figure out how to turn himself in without destroying the family name. Father O'Malley sat down heavily in one of the visitor chairs, the folder still clutched in his hands. You're saying, Michael spoke for the first time since entering the room, his voice tight with controlled anger, that Catherine's daughter, this beautiful little girl, has a father who's alive, who never knew she existed, and you've let him believe he's dead to his family for 4 years? Thomas doesn't know he's dead to us, Harold said miserably. He's been in California using an assumed name, working construction, living like a ghost because he thinks we disowned him for deserting. I've had private investigators keeping track of him for years, making sure he's safe, but I never contacted him, never told him he could come home. Catherine's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. When did Thomas and I don't remember ever meeting anyone named Thomas Shaw. Summer of '69, Harold said. He was staying with a friend near Brooklyn College. He'd started taking night classes under a fake name, said he wanted to finish his education, wanted to become someone other than a Shaw. You were in the same American literature class. And suddenly Catherine remembered. A quiet, intense young man who'd sat in the back row, who'd loaned her his notes when she'd missed a class, who'd walked her home one night after a late session at the library because the streets weren't safe, who'd kissed her under a streetlight and told her she was the first real thing he'd encountered in months of feeling like a shadow. One night. They'd spent one night together before he'd disappeared, leaving only a note saying he had to leave town suddenly, that it wasn't her fault, that he'd never forget her. She'd never even known his real last name. "Oh God," she whispered, tears streaming down her face now. Emma's father is Thomas Shaw. And that's when Emma spoke up for the first time since entering the hospital, her small voice cutting through the adult anguish with childlike clarity. "Is my daddy alive? Can I meet him?" The question, so innocent, so full of hope, broke something open in the room. Harold Shaw began to sob, the monitors beside his bed beeping frantically. The lawyers shifted uncomfortably. Raymond Shaw turned away, pressing his forehead against the doorframe. "He's alive, sweetheart," Father O'Malley said gently, kneeling beside Emma. "He's alive and he's in California and he doesn't know about you yet, but we're going to tell him," Catherine finished, her voice suddenly steel. She turned to Harold Shaw with an expression that made the dying man flinch. "You're going to tell me exactly where Thomas is. You're going to give me every piece of information you have. And then you're going to set up a trust fund for Emma that ensures she never wants for anything. Not as payment for your lies, but as the bare minimum a grandfather owes his granddaughter." "I've already prepared the trust," one of the lawyers said quickly. "Irrevocable, substantial, with provisions for education, housing, health care." "I don't care about the money," Catherine interrupted. "I care about my daughter knowing her father. I care about Thomas Shaw learning that he has a child who needs him, that he's not alone in the world the way you made him believe he was." Harold Shaw nodded weakly, unable to speak through his tears and his failing lungs. Michael squeezed Catherine's hand. "We'll find him. We'll tell him. And then—" He looked at Emma with extraordinary gentleness. "Then this little girl will have what every child deserves. A father who wants her." But what none of them could have anticipated was that finding Thomas Shaw wouldn't require a trip to California or a detective's investigation, because at that exact moment, on the 7th floor of Brooklyn Methodist Hospital, a man in a worn denim jacket was stepping out of the elevator, having come to visit his father one final time, to attempt a reconciliation he'd been building courage for across 3,000 miles and 4 years of exile. Thomas Shaw was already in the building, and he was about to walk past room 714 just as the door opened, and a little girl with his eyes looked up and asked her mother a question that would change everything. "Mama, is that him?" Time moved differently in hospital corridors, stretched and compressed simultaneously, like memory itself. Thomas Shaw walked with the slow deliberation of a man approaching either salvation or damnation, unsure which waited behind his father's door. He'd driven cross-country in 3 days, stopping only for gas and fitful sleep in rest stop parking lots. The telegram from Raymond had been cryptic. "Father dying, says he needs to see you. Come home if you can, no judgment. Promise. Arta." Thomas hadn't believed the no judgment part, but he'd come anyway, because dying men deserved the truth, even from sons who disappointed them. He wore construction worker clothes, Levi's stiff with plaster dust, work boots that had seen better years, a flannel shirt under the denim jacket. His hair was longer than the military cut he'd once maintained, and a beard covered the jawline that newspapers had once photographed at charity galas and country club dinners. He looked nothing like the golden boy who'd attended Yale, who'd been groomed for politics, who'd worn his uniform with pride before the weight of what he'd witnessed in Southeast Asia had broken something fundamental inside him. He was 10 feet from room 714 when the door opened. Emma saw him first. She'd been holding her mother's hand, still processing the impossible revelation that her father, her actual father, existed somewhere in the world. And then this man appeared. walking toward them with the late afternoon sun from the hallway windows catching the gold in his brown hair. And something inside her small chest recognized him before her mind could articulate why. "Mama," she said, tugging Catherine's hand. "Is that him?" Thomas stopped walking. His eyes went to the little girl, then up to the woman holding her hand, and his face underwent a transformation that everyone watching would remember for the rest of their lives. Confusion melting into recognition, melting into absolute shock. "Catherine," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Catherine Walsh?" Catherine couldn't speak. She stood frozen in the hospital corridor with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and the smell of antiseptic burning her nostrils, and this man she'd spent 4 years trying to forget, standing before her like a ghost made flesh. "Thomas," she finally managed. Raymond Shaw appeared in the doorway behind Catherine, his face stricken with something between joy and grief. "Tommy, you came." Thomas looked at his brother, then back to Catherine, then down to Emma. His eyes, hazel flecked with green, were mirrors of the little girl's. The shape of her nose, the curve of her mouth, the way she tilted her head when studying something unfamiliar. All of it was his. "I don't understand," Thomas said, but his voice suggested he was beginning to. "Come inside," Father O'Malley said gently, appearing behind Raymond. "Your father has some things he needs to tell you, things that should have been said years ago." The next 30 minutes unfolded like a fever dream. They crowded into Harold Shaw's hospital room. Catherine, Emma, Michael, Thomas, Raymond, the priest, Catherine's mother, the lawyers still clutching their briefcases. Harold Shaw, propped up on his pillows with oxygen hissing and monitors beeping their steady rhythm, told his second son what he'd just finished confessing to Catherine. The desertion he'd covered up by claiming death, the paternity test he'd buried, the daughter Thomas never knew existed, the 4 years of lies that had kept a family apart. Thomas listened without interrupting, his hand gripping the bed rail so tightly his knuckles went white. When Harold finally finished, silence filled the room like water, heavy and suffocating. "You let me believe I'd destroyed the family name," Thomas said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You let me live like a dead man for 4 years, and all that time I had a daughter?" He turned to look at Emma, who was watching him with wide, fearless eyes. "How old are you, sweetheart?" 3.5, Emma answered solemnly. "But I'll be 4 in October." Thomas did the math silently, his lips moving. October would make her conception sometime in January. No, late December or early January. But he'd been with Catherine in August of '69, which meant, "She's premature," Catherine said quickly, understanding his confusion. "I went into labor 3 weeks early during a storm. Father O'Malley delivered her." The priest nodded confirmation. Thomas sank into a chair, his head in his hands. When he looked up again, tears streaked his face. "I thought about you," he said to Catherine. "After I left Brooklyn, after I disappeared, I thought about you all the time. Wondered if you'd forgiven me for running. Wondered if you'd found someone better, someone who wasn't a coward." "You weren't a coward," Catherine said fiercely. "You were a man who'd seen too much horror and had the courage to walk away from a war you didn't believe in. The army would call it desertion. My father called it dishonor." Thomas glanced at Harold, who looked away. "What would you call it?" "Survival," Catherine answered simply. Michael, who'd been standing silently beside Catherine through all of this, cleared his throat. "I'm Michael Brennan. I was supposed to marry Catherine today." About 3 hours ago, actually. Thomas looked at him with stricken eyes. Oh God, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. This is your wedding day? Was our wedding day, Michael corrected gently. But things got complicated. Michael has cancer, Catherine said quietly. Terminal. He proposed to me because he wanted to take care of Emma and me before he died. He tried to run from the altar this morning because he thought marrying him would trap me in a short, painful future. She looked at Michael with such love that it made Thomas's chest ache. But I told him I'd rather have 2 years with someone who loves me than a lifetime with someone who doesn't. The words hung in the air, and Thomas understood what she was really saying, that love was worth the inevitable pain of loss, that choosing to show up, even when the ending was predetermined, was the bravest thing a person could do. I don't know how to be a father, Thomas said, looking at Emma. I've been running for so long, I barely know how to be a person. Emma walked over to him, her little patent leather shoes clicking on the hospital floor. She studied his face with the serious attention children bring to important decisions. Then she climbed into his lap, arranging herself carefully, and rested her head against his chest. You can learn, she said simply. Thomas's arms came around her automatically, protectively, as if his body knew what his mind was still struggling to accept. He buried his face in her hair, silk and sunshine and baby shampoo, and wept like he hadn't wept since the night he'd watched his best friend die in a rice paddy 10,000 miles from home. Raymond moved to stand beside his brother, one hand on Thomas's shoulder. Father O'Malley bowed his head in silent prayer. Catherine's mother dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Even the lawyers looked moved, their professional detachment cracking. Harold Shaw watched from his bed, his breathing more labored now. Thomas, he rasped, I can't undo the harm, can't give back the years, but I can. He gestured weakly to one of the lawyers. The lawyer stepped forward. Your father has prepared documents that restore your full legal identity. You're no longer considered a deserter. He's arranged for your discharge to be reclassified as medical separation for psychological trauma, which is what it should have been in the first place. You have access to all family trusts, properties, accounts, and he's named you as executor of Emma's trust fund. I don't want his money, Thomas said without looking up from Emma. It's not for you, Harold whispered. It's for her. So she never has to struggle the way Catherine did. So she knows her grandfather tried to make amends, even though amends are impossible. Thomas finally looked at his father. You're right. Amends are impossible. But I'll take the trust fund for Emma, and I'll make sure she knows the truth about all of this, about why her family was kept apart, and about the cost of pride and lies. Harold nodded, seeming to shrink even smaller into his pillows. But, Thomas continued, his voice stronger now, I want one more thing. I want you to acknowledge Emma publicly. I want the Shaw family to claim her, not as a scandal or a secret, but as the legitimate grandchild she is. I want her birth certificate amended to show my name as her father. Can you do that? The lawyers have already prepared the paperwork, Raymond said quietly. Emma Shaw, or Emma Walsh Shaw, if Catherine prefers. Catherine looked at her daughter, curled trustingly in her father's arms, and felt something, fundamental shift in her understanding of the world. This morning, she'd been preparing to marry a dying man out of love and pragmatism. Now she stood in a hospital room watching her daughter meet a father who'd been dead for 4 years, but was somehow alive again, and she realized that families could be unmade and remade in a single afternoon. Emma Walsh Shaw, Catherine decided. She should carry both names, both histories. Thomas looked up at her with such gratitude and something else, something that might have been the embers of that one night 4 years ago, still glowing beneath the ash of everything that had happened since. Catherine, he started, but she shook her head. Not now. There's too much to process, too many decisions to make. But Thomas... She moved closer, her hand reaching out to touch Emma's back, almost touching his shoulder in the process. I'm glad you're alive. I'm glad Emma gets to know you. What about the wedding? Emma asked suddenly, looking up at her mother with concern. Are you still going to marry Mr. Michael? Everyone turned to look at Michael, who stood with his hands in his pockets, a gentle smile on his face despite the impossible emotional complexity of the moment. You know what? Michael said. I think we've had enough drama for one day. Catherine, I love you. That hasn't changed. But maybe we table the wedding conversation until everyone's had a chance to breathe. Until Thomas has figured out where he's going to live. Until Emma's processed having a father. Until we're not all standing in a hospital room making life-altering decisions under fluorescent lights. Hope flickered in Catherine's chest. Father O'Malley nodded approvingly. Wise counsel. Love doesn't expire. It can wait for the right moment. But they were about to discover that some moments couldn't wait, because Harold Shaw's monitors were beginning to alarm, his breathing growing more shallow, and the man who'd set all of this in motion was about to leave the world he'd damaged so thoroughly, taking with him the last secrets he hadn't yet confessed. And his final words, whispered to Thomas as doctors rushed in, would reveal one more impossible truth that would bind this fractured family together in ways none of them could yet imagine. The crash team descended with practiced urgency, their movements choreographed by years of emergency response. Everyone out! The lead doctor barked, but Harold Shaw's trembling hand shot out, gripping Thomas's wrist with surprising strength. Wait! Harold gasped. Need to. Tell him. The doctor checked the monitors, made a quick assessment. 2 minutes. That's all you have. Raymond ushered everyone toward the door, but Thomas leaned close to his father's face, near enough to smell death's approach. That particular sweetness of organs shutting down, of a body surrendering. Thomas, Harold whispered, his eyes urgent despite their dimming. Your mother. She knew. About California. About you being alive. She's known the whole time. Thomas went rigid. What? She's been sending you money, Harold continued, each word a struggle. Through an account you thought was a trust fund from your aunt. That wasn't your aunt. It was Elizabeth, your mother. She's been protecting you, supporting you, waiting for me to... He coughed, a wet, rattling sound, waiting for me to stop being a coward. The revelation hit Thomas like a physical blow. The mysterious deposits that had appeared in his California bank account every month for 4 years. The money he'd assumed was from a family trust his aunt had mentioned once. It had been his mother all along, silently loving him from across the country, while he'd believed himself dead to his entire family. She wants to meet Emma, Harold gasped. Made me promise. Made me swear that if I contacted you, I'd tell you. She never stopped being your mother. Never stopped. His voice cut off as another alarm shrieked. The doctor pushed Thomas aside gently but firmly. That's enough. Out. Now. Thomas stumbled backward into the hallway where the others waited. His face had gone pale, his hands shaking. Raymond caught him by the shoulders. Tommy, what did he say? Mom knew, Thomas said numbly. She's known I was alive this whole time. Raymond's face registered shock, then something else, a memory clicking into place. The trips, he said slowly. She's been taking trips to California. Said she was visiting old friends. I thought, God, I'm an idiot. She was visiting you? Not visiting, just watching maybe, making sure I was okay. Thomas looked at Catherine, at Emma still holding his hand. She's been waiting for this, for me to come home, for all of this. Inside the hospital room, the monitors screamed their high-pitched wail, then fell silent. The doctor's voice, muffled but clear. Time of death, 5:47 p.m. Harold Shaw was gone. The hallway fell into stunned silence. Even Emma seemed to understand the weight of what had just happened, pressing closer to her father's leg. Father O'Malley made the sign of the cross and murmured a prayer in Latin, the ancient words a comfort against the sterile modernity of the hospital corridor. Catherine's mother spoke first, her voice surprisingly gentle. He was a terrible man who did terrible things, but in the end, he tried to make it right. That counts for something. Does it? Thomas asked bitterly. 4 years, Ma. 4 years I could have known my daughter. 4 years Catherine struggled alone. Does a deathbed confession really make up for that? No, Michael said quietly. But it gives you a chance to do better. To not waste the years you have left. The pointed reminder of his own mortality hung in the air. Thomas looked at Michael, really looked at him for the first time, saw the thinness beneath his clothes, the shadows under his eyes, the careful way he moved as if conserving energy for the battles ahead. I'm sorry, Thomas said, about the cancer, about interrupting your wedding, about all of this. Don't be, Michael replied. I spent the morning trying to run from the best thing that ever happened to me because I thought I was protecting Catherine from pain. You've just been given a gift. Time with your daughter, a chance to build something real. Don't waste it the way I almost did. One of the lawyers cleared his throat awkwardly. Mr. Shaw, Thomas, there are arrangements to be made. Your father's will, the funeral, the estate, and there's the matter of contacting your mother. She's in Manhattan, Raymond said. The apartment on the Upper East Side. I can call her or... No, Thomas interrupted. I'll tell her myself. She deserves to hear about Dad from family, not over the phone. He looked down at Emma. Would you like to meet your grandmother? Your other grandmother? Emma's eyes widened. I have 2 grandmas? You do, Catherine said softly. And something tells me Elizabeth Shaw is going to love you very much. They left Brooklyn Methodist as the winter sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The lawyers stayed behind to handle the death certificate and notifications. Father O'Malley offered to return to St. Michael's and explain to any remaining guests that the wedding had been postponed indefinitely. What about the church? Catherine asked as they stood in the hospital parking lot, breath misting in the February cold. We left everyone just sitting there. I called Tom from the hospital room, Michael said. Your wedding guests went home hours ago, Catherine. But the flowers are still there. The candles. Everything's waiting whenever you're ready. If you're still ready, his tone implied. Catherine looked at Thomas, at Michael, at her daughter standing between them, holding both their hands. The geometry of their situation was impossible. A dying fiancé who loved her, a resurrected father who'd loved her once, a daughter who needed them both. There was no guidebook for navigating this kind of emotional complexity. I need time, she said finally. We all need time. Thomas needs to reconnect with his mother, to figure out where he fits in Emma's life. Michael needs... Her voice broke slightly. Michael needs to focus on treatment, on fighting this thing as hard as he can. And I need to figure out who I am when I'm not just surviving, but actually building a life. What about Emma? Thomas asked. Where does she fit while we're all figuring things out? With me, Catherine said firmly. Always with me, but also with you, Thomas, as much as you want, and with Michael, if he still wants to be part of our lives. I do, Michael said without hesitation. Whatever that looks like, I do. They stood there in the fading light, an unlikely constellation of people bound together by love and loss and the strange mercy of second chances. Raymond Shaw watched his brother with Emma and thought about the family secrets that had nearly destroyed them all. Father O'Malley thought about the mysterious ways grief and grace could coexist in a single moment. Catherine's mother thought about her daughter's strength and how suffering had forged it into something unbreakable. There's one more thing, Thomas said suddenly. Catherine, when we were together that night in '69, before I disappeared, I told you something. Do you remember? Catherine thought back through the years. You said a lot of things. I told you that if the world ever made sense again, if I ever became someone who could offer more than broken pieces, I'd find you. Thomas's voice was steady now, certain. I didn't find you. God or fate or whatever orchestrates these things did. But I'm here now, and I want to keep the promise I made, even if it takes different form than I imagined. What promise? Emma asked. Thomas knelt beside his daughter. I promised your mother that I would try to become someone worth knowing, someone worth loving, and now I promise you the same thing. I'm going to show up. I'm going to learn how to be your father. I'm going to make mistakes and ask forgiveness and keep trying anyway. Can you give me a chance to do that? Emma studied his face with that serious expression she wore when making important decisions. Then she nodded. Okay. But you have to read me bedtime stories, and teach me about horses, and come to my birthday party in October. Deal, Thomas said, offering his hand to shake. Emma took it solemnly, and the gesture, so formal, so childishly earnest, made everyone smile despite the weight of the day. They divided into separate cars for the drive into Manhattan. Raymond took Thomas in his sedan. Catherine, Emma, and Michael rode with Catherine's mother. Father O'Malley returned to Brooklyn in a taxi, promising to keep the church prepared for whenever they were ready to return. The Shaw family apartment overlooked Central Park, its windows glowing against the darkening sky. Elizabeth Shaw answered the door herself. No staff, no intermediaries, just a woman in her early 60s with silver-streaked hair and eyes that were exact replicas of Thomas's. She saw her son standing in the hallway, and the crystal tumbler she'd been holding slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marble floor. Thomas, she breathed. Then louder, disbelieving. Thomas. He crossed the threshold and pulled her into his arms. I know, Mom. Dad told me. I know you've been watching over me. I know you never gave up. Elizabeth Shaw wept into her son's shoulder. 4 years of secret grief pouring out in racking sobs. When she finally pulled back, she saw the small girl standing behind Thomas, partially hidden by Catherine. Is this... Elizabeth couldn't finish the sentence. This is Emma, Thomas said, gently guiding his daughter forward. Your granddaughter, Emma Walsh Shaw, and this is Catherine, her mother. Catherine, my mother, Elizabeth. Elizabeth knelt slowly, arthritis making the movement careful. She took Emma's small hands in her perfectly manicured ones, tears still streaming down her face. Hello, sweetheart. I'm so very happy to meet you. Are you going to cry all the time? Emma asked with childlike bluntness. Because if you are, I should warn you. Grown-ups cry a lot around me lately. The unexpected humor broke the tension. Elizabeth laughed through her tears. I promise to try to do other things besides cry. How about we have hot chocolate instead? Do you like hot chocolate? With marshmallows? As many marshmallows as you want. They moved into the apartment's enormous living room, all cream carpets and museum-quality art. Emma was immediately enchanted by a collection of crystal figurines on a shelf, and Elizabeth carefully took them down one by one, letting her granddaughter examine each piece while explaining where it came from. Catherine watched this scene, her daughter being welcomed into a world of wealth and privilege that should have been her birthright all along, and felt Michael's hand find hers. You okay? He whispered. I don't know, she admitted. This morning, I was a single mother struggling to make ends meet, about to marry a man I loved who was dying. Tonight, Emma has a father, a grandmother, a trust fund, and a place in one of New York's most prominent families. It's too much change too fast. Change doesn't care about our comfort, Michael observed. It just happens. What matters is what we do with it. Elizabeth overheard this and looked up from where she sat with Emma. Catherine, I know you don't know me. You have no reason to trust the Shaw family after what Harold did to you, but I want you to understand something. She stood, crossing to where Catherine and Michael stood. When Harold told me about the pregnancy 4 years ago, when he said he'd paid you off and sent you away, I believed him when he said the paternity test was negative. I thought you were a young woman who'd made a mistake and had taken the money to start over. I didn't question it because... She paused, shame coloring her voice. Because I wanted to believe it. Because it was easier than confronting the truth. What truth? Catherine asked. That my husband was a cruel man, who valued reputation over human decency. That both my sons had been damaged by the way we raised them. James taught to be selfish. Thomas taught that love was weakness. Elizabeth's voice strengthened. But Thomas broke that pattern. He walked away from a war that was destroying his soul, and he walked away from a family that couldn't see his humanity. And now he has a chance to raise Emma differently, to show her that love is strength, not weakness. She took Catherine's hands. I can't undo the past 4 years, but I can promise you this. Emma will never doubt she's loved. She'll never question her worth. And you, Elizabeth's eyes filled again, you will never struggle alone again. Not financially, not emotionally, not in any way. You saved my son by giving him a daughter to fight for. Let me help you both. Catherine felt tears sliding down her own cheeks now. I don't need charity. It's not charity, Elizabeth said firmly. It's family, which is something you've earned the right to claim. The evening unfolded with unexpected warmth. Emma fell asleep on the plush carpet, surrounded by crystal animals, her head resting on a velvet cushion. Thomas carried her to a guest room while Catherine and Elizabeth talked quietly about practical arrangements, visits, custody, how to navigate this new reality. Michael sat with Raymond, the two men discussing treatment options and clinical trials. Raymond using his FBI connections to identify the best oncologists in the country. It was nearly midnight when Catherine finally gathered her sleeping daughter and prepared to leave. Thomas walked them to the elevator, his hand lingering on Emma's hair as Catherine held her. Thank you, he said quietly, for raising her, for doing it alone when you shouldn't have had to, for being strong enough that she feels safe in this chaos. Thank you for coming back, Catherine replied, for showing up, even when you were terrified. That's the kind of father she needs. The elevator doors opened. Michael was already inside, having said his goodbyes. But before Catherine could step in, Thomas caught her hand. "I'm not going to ask you not to marry him," he said. "He loves you. That's obvious. And you love him. But Catherine, when this is over, when Michael has fought as hard as he can, if you survive the grief that's coming—" He stopped, struggling for words. "I'll still be here. I'll wait. However long it takes." Catherine's heart twisted. "Thomas, you don't have to say anything," he interrupted gently. "Just know it. Just know that 4 years ago I told you I'd find my way back, and I meant it." The elevator doors closed on Catherine's tear-stained face, on Michael's knowing smile, on Emma sleeping peacefully against her mother's shoulder, unaware that her family had just expanded in ways that would take years to fully understand. As the elevator descended toward the lobby, toward the February night and the long drive back to Brooklyn, Catherine felt the full weight of impossible choices settling on her shoulders. She loved Michael. She'd loved him from the moment he'd noticed her struggling with a broken heel outside the courthouse where she worked, had offered his handkerchief and then his number. She'd loved him through his proposal, through discovering his illness, through his attempted escape at the altar. But she'd also loved Thomas once, in a different way, in a single perfect night before the world became complicated. And now he was back, alive, offering a future she'd thought was impossible. "He's a good man," Michael said quietly, reading her thoughts. "When I'm gone, if he's still here, you should give him a chance." "Don't," Catherine whispered. "Don't plan for that. Not yet." "Someone has to," Michael replied. "Because I love you enough to want you to be happy after I'm gone. And if happiness looks like Thomas Shaw, I can live with that. Or die with it, I suppose." The dark humor was so quintessentially Michael that Catherine laughed despite her tears. And in that moment, holding her daughter while the man she loved made peace with his own mortality, Catherine Walsh Shaw understood something fundamental about love, that it wasn't finite, wasn't a single choice between one person or another, but a continuous practice of showing up, telling truth, and choosing kindness even when, especially when, the future was uncertain. Outside, the city glittered with a million lights, each one a life being lived, a story unfolding. And somewhere in that vast constellation of human experience, 4 people bound by love and loss and impossible timing were learning that families could be built from broken pieces, and that grace sometimes looked like a locked church door and a priest who refused to give up on love, even when love itself seemed ready to surrender. Spring came to Brooklyn with the gentle insistence of resurrection. The cherry trees along Montague Street burst into impossible pink, and St. Michael's Church, which had stood vigil through winter's harshest days, felt the warmth finally penetrate its thick stone walls. Catherine stood in the small garden behind the church, watching Emma chase butterflies through the newly planted flowers. It was May now, 3 months since the wedding that never happened. 3 months since Harold Shaw's death had unraveled a family's secrets and stitched together an improbable new one. 3 months of impossible juggling. Michael's treatment had been more brutal than anyone anticipated. The experimental trial at Sloan Kettering had ravaged his body with its attempts to kill the cancer, leaving him gaunt and exhausted, but, miraculously, still fighting. The tumor had shrunk. Not enough to call it remission, the doctors cautioned, but enough to buy time. Maybe another year. Maybe 2 if they were lucky. Thomas had moved back to New York, taking an apartment in Brooklyn Heights close enough to visit Emma 3 times a week. He'd started therapy, working through the trauma of war, of desertion, of believing himself dead to everyone who'd loved him. And slowly, carefully, he was learning how to be a father. How to braid Emma's hair badly and tell bedtime stories with funny voices and show up even when showing up was uncomfortable. Elizabeth Shaw had become a constant presence too. The grandmother who'd been denied her first 4 years, making up for lost time with elaborate tea parties and museum trips, and a standing invitation for Sunday dinners at the Manhattan apartment. She'd also quietly paid off Catherine's student loans, covered Emma's preschool tuition, and set up college funds that would ensure the child never worried about money. But none of the money, none of the second chances, none of the unexpected grace had answered the question that Catherine woke up with every morning. What now? She's getting so big, a voice said behind her. Catherine turned to find Father O'Malley standing in the garden doorway, his hands clasped behind his back in that patient way he had. Growing like a weed, she agreed. Last week she told me she wants to be a veterinarian and a ballerina and the president. Not sure how she'll manage all three. The young believe anything is possible, the priest observed. It's only we old souls who start limiting our options. He moved to stand beside her, both of them watching Emma's joyful pursuit of a particularly stubborn butterfly. I've kept the church ready, he said after a moment. The flowers, the candles, the guest list, all of it. Whenever you want to finish what you started. Catherine's throat tightened. Father, I don't know if... Michael's not getting better, Father O'Malley said gently. I visited him yesterday at the hospital. He wanted to talk about funeral arrangements. The words hit like a fist to the sternum. What? No. The treatment is working. The doctors said he has more time than they initially thought. But Catherine, child, more time isn't the same as recovery. Michael knows that. He's known it from the beginning. Catherine sank onto a stone bench, her legs suddenly unreliable. Emma noticed her mother's distress and came running over, her small hands immediately reaching for Catherine's face. Mama, why sad? I'm okay, baby, Catherine managed. Just tired. You're always tired, Emma observed with uncomfortable accuracy. Maybe you need more marshmallows in your hot chocolate. That's what Grandma Elizabeth says fixes everything. Despite her anguish, Catherine laughed. Your grandmother might be on to something. Emma, satisfied that her mother wasn't in immediate crisis, returned to the butterflies. Father O'Malley sat beside Catherine, his old bones creaking with the movement. Michael told me something else, he said quietly. He said he wants you to marry Thomas. After. He said Thomas loves you. Emma loves him, and he can't bear the thought of you being alone when he's gone. That's not... Catherine's voice broke. That's not how love works. You can't just transfer your affections like a bank account. Can't you? The priest's question was genuine, not rhetorical. Catherine, I've been doing this for 40 years. Marrying people, burying people, watching how love survives or doesn't survive grief. And I've learned something. Love isn't a finite resource. Loving one person doesn't mean you can't love another. And choosing to build a future with someone new doesn't diminish what you had before. But it feels like betrayal, Catherine whispered. Michael is still alive. He's still fighting. And I'm supposed to what? Plan for the future with another man? That's monstrous. It's human, Father O'Malley corrected. And Michael isn't asking you to stop loving him. He's asking you to not stop living when he's gone. They sat in silence for a long moment, the May breeze carrying the scent of cherry blossoms and fresh earth. Finally, Catherine spoke again, her voice small and broken. "I don't know how to do this, Father. How to love two men at once. How to grieve someone who's still here. How to plan a future when the present is so precarious." "You do it one day at a time," the priest said. "One choice at a time. And you let yourself be held by the people who love you. All of them. Michael, Thomas, your mother, Elizabeth, Emma, even me, you stubborn girl." Catherine leaned her head on his shoulder. This man who'd saved her life once and was now trying to save her heart. "What would you do?" she asked. "If you were me?" Father O'Malley was quiet for a long time. Then, "I'd marry Michael. Today, if possible. Tomorrow at the latest. I'd give him that gift, the knowledge that he made good on his promise to be your husband, even if only for a little while. I'd let him walk you down an aisle and say his vows and wear a ring that means something. And then," his voice grew thick with emotion, "then I'd love him as fiercely as possible for however much time God grants. And when he's gone, when the grief finally loosens its grip, I'd let myself love again. Because that's what Michael wants. That's what he's fighting for. Not more time for himself, but more life for you." The tears Catherine had been holding back since February finally came. Great racking sobs that shook her entire body. Emma abandoned the butterflies and climbed into her lap, her small arms wrapping around her mother's neck. "Don't cry, Mama. The butterflies will come back. They always do. Out of the mouths of babes." That evening, Catherine drove to Sloan Kettering. Michael was in his hospital room, reading a book about Montana, ranches and wilderness and wide-open spaces he'd never see again. He looked up when she entered, and his smile was the same one he'd given her outside the courthouse a year ago, full of uncomplicated warmth. "Hey," he said. "This is a nice surprise." Catherine crossed the room and kissed him, hard and desperate and full of everything she couldn't say. When she pulled back, his eyes were wet. "I want to get married," she said. "Tomorrow, at St. Michael's. Just us and Emma and whoever else can make it on short notice. I want to be your wife, Michael Brennan. For however long we have." Michael's face crumpled. "Catherine." "No arguments," she interrupted. "No more protecting me from pain or trying to make the noble sacrifice. You asked me to marry you. I said yes. Let's finish what we started." He pulled her onto the hospital bed beside him, careful of the IV lines and monitors. They lay there together, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat, steady now, but fragile, borrowed time ticking away with each pulse. "Okay," he whispered into her hair. "Okay, let's get married." The wedding happened 2 days later on a Thursday afternoon in May. Father O'Malley had worked miracles to pull it together. The flowers, the music, the small gathering of people who'd become family through crisis and grace. Catherine wore the same cream dress she'd sewn back in February, now altered slightly because she'd lost weight from stress. Emma wore her flower crown, only slightly worse for wear after 3 months in a closet. Michael wore a suit borrowed from Thomas, the two men having developed an unlikely friendship based on shared love for the same woman and mutual understanding that some things mattered more than jealousy. Elizabeth Shaw sat in the front pew beside Catherine's mother, the two grandmothers united in their determination to witness this strange, beautiful moment. Raymond Shaw stood as Michael's best man, having appointed himself guardian of his brother's second chance at family. Thomas sat farther back, his presence a promise of future rather than competition for present. Dearly beloved, Father O'Malley began, his voice strong. Despite his age, we are gathered here today, finally, to join Michael and Catherine in holy matrimony. The ceremony was brief. No lengthy homilies, no complicated rituals, just two people making promises they'd honor for as long as humanly possible. When Michael slipped the simple gold band onto Catherine's finger, his hand trembled. When Catherine said, "I do," her voice carried the weight of choosing love even when love guaranteed future pain. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Father O'Malley said, his own voice thick with emotion. "Michael, you may kiss your bride." And he did, gentle and reverent, like she was something precious he'd been given to hold, but not to keep. The small reception happened in St. Michael's Parish Hall. Cake from a local bakery, champagne that Emma wasn't allowed to drink, and toasts that balanced joy with the unspoken knowledge that this celebration was also a kind of pre-grieving. Thomas raised his glass last. "To Michael and Catherine," he said, his voice steady. "Michael, you're a better man than I am. You chose to show up even when walking away would have been easier. You chose to love even when love meant certain loss. And Catherine," he looked at her directly now, "you chose courage over comfort. You chose presence over safety. You both remind us that love isn't about guarantees. It's about showing up anyway." Later, as the sun set and the party wound down, Emma fell asleep in her grandmother's arms, and Michael sat with Catherine on the church steps, watching the Brooklyn evening settle over their neighborhood. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for this, for saying yes even when yes was terrifying." "Thank you for asking," Catherine replied, "even when you tried to run." "I'm glad Father O'Malley locked those doors," Michael said with a faint smile. "Best thing that ever happened to me." They sat in comfortable silence, newlyweds with an expiration date neither wanted to acknowledge. Inside the church, Father O'Malley was extinguishing candles, putting things in order for Sunday services. Thomas was helping clean up, his daughter's flower crown carefully preserved in his jacket pocket. Elizabeth and Catherine's mother were comparing photos on their cameras, building a shared archive of this impossible day. "When I'm gone," Michael started, but Catherine pressed her fingers to his lips. "Not tonight," she whispered. "Tonight we're just married, just happy, just here." So they sat on the church steps as stars emerged overhead, as the city hummed its evening song around them, as their daughter slept peacefully inside surrounded by family that had been broken and remade into something stronger than before. Michael Brennan died 8 months later, on a January morning when snow was falling soft and silent over Brooklyn. He died at home in the apartment he'd shared with Catherine and Emma, with his wife holding one hand and his stepdaughter holding the other. His last words were, "Thank you for the time." Thomas Shaw married Catherine Walsh Brennan 2 years after that, in the same church where she'd first tried to marry Michael. Emma served as flower girl again, now 7 years old and solemn with the understanding of second chances. The wedding was joyful, but not untouched by memory. Father O'Malley made sure to light a candle for Michael during the ceremony, acknowledging that some loves never end. They simply make room for new ones alongside them. And if you visit St. Michael's Church in Brooklyn today, you'll find a small plaque near the entrance that reads, "In memory of Michael Brennan, who taught us that love isn't measured in years, but in the courage to show up anyway." They say that on February evenings when the wind howls just right, you can still hear the echo of oak doors slamming shut, a priest's defiant act that saved not just one wedding, but an entire family that didn't know it needed saving. If this story moved you, Leave a comment telling me what spoke to your heart, and subscribe, because the most powerful stories are the ones we choose to remember together.